I was standing in the narrow hallway of our row house, trying to keep the technician from stepping on the rug I just vacuumed. It was mid-November in Fairbanks, and the air coming through the window frames already had that sharp, metallic bite that told you the real winter was about to lock the doors. The technician, a guy named Mike who looked like he'd spent the last decade fighting losing battles with old boilers, was packing his tool bag. He'd spent 3 hours replacing the blower motor in our furnace, a part that had to be flown in from Anchorage, because nobody in town had the specific model in stock. All set, Mike said, wiping his hands on a rag. She's humming. Just keep an eye on the filter for a few weeks. Thanks, Mike, I said. I reached for my phone to pull up the payment portal. I'll just settle the balance now. Dennis said the deposit was already handled via the ACH transfer last Tuesday. Mike paused, his hand on the door handle. He didn't look at me. He looked at his tablet. About that. The transfer didn't clear. It bounced back this morning. I actually tried calling your husband around 10, but I didn't get a hold of him. I felt a small, tight knot form under my ribs. I'm an IT support specialist. My entire professional life is based on the idea that if a signal is sent, it either arrives or it generates an error code. There is no maybe in a data packet. Bounced? I asked. That's not possible. We have the funds. He specifically told me he'd moved the money from the savings account on Monday. Mike shrugged, the movement heavy and tired. Look, me? I don't know the banking side of it. I just know the office says the payment is outstanding. It's $1,200. I can't leave the paperwork open on this. I stepped back into the living room and called for Dennis. He was in the small office nook we'd carved out of a former pantry, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and old files. He's a paralegal, and he treats his desk like a fortress. When he emerged, he was wearing his reading glasses and holding a lukewarm cup of coffee. He looked startled, as if I'd interrupted a deep meditation rather than just calling his name. The blower motor payment bounced, Dennis, I said. I didn't raise my voice, but I kept it flat. Mike is still here. He says the ACH didn't clear. Dennis blinked. He didn't look at Mike. He looked at the coffee in his mug. Bounced? That's strange. I handled that. I thought we already discussed the timing on the transfer. I stopped. Discussed it? When? You told me on Monday that it was done. You said, Chris, don't worry about the furnace. I've already moved the money. Right, he said, his voice sliding into that smooth, professional tone he uses with difficult clients. But I mentioned that the quarterly draw from the firm was lagging. I thought I'd made it clear that we might have a few days of overlap where the accounts were lean. I assumed you understood that we were just riding a slow quarter. I stared at him. He was repeating a promise that the money was handled, but he was framing it as a conversation we'd already had, a shared understanding that didn't actually exist. It was a classic Dennis move. He'd create a version of the past where I was already in agreement with him, which he was making me feel like I was the one who'd forgotten the conversation. You never mentioned a lag, I said, and riding a slow quarter doesn't make a transfer bounce. A transfer bounces because the money isn't there. It's just a timing issue with the bank, Chris. Don't make it a thing, he said. He finally looked at me, and there was a flicker of something. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of impatient annoyance, as if my insistence on the facts was an inconvenience to his day. I'll call the bank. I'll get it sorted by tomorrow. Mike cleared his throat. He was still standing in the hallway, looking profoundly uncomfortable. I really can't leave the job open, Mr. Pham. My boss is a stickler for the end-of-day ledger. Dennis sighed, a long theatrical sound. He reached for his wallet, pulled out a credit card, and handed it to Mike. Just run it on this for now. I'll reconcile it with the savings account later tonight. I watched Mike swipe the card and print a small receipt. The air stayed heavy, but the silence felt different now. As soon as the door closed behind the technician, the silence settled in. I wanted to ask him exactly how much was left in the savings account. I wanted to ask why a paralegal at a stable firm was suddenly worried about a slow quarter for a $1,200 repair. But as I looked at him, I saw the way he was already retreating back toward his office, his shoulders hunched, the coffee cup still gripped in his hand. I've always hated the noise of a real fight. In a house this small, with the walls as thin as ours, An argument doesn't just stay in one room. It vibrates through the floorboards. I told myself that if the card went through, the immediate problem was solved. I told myself that he was probably just stressed with a big case and had mismanaged the transfer. Just let me know when the bank fixes the error, I said. Will do, he replied, not turning around. I didn't push it, and he didn't offer more. Saturday morning usually followed a strict rhythm. I'd start the first load of towels, move the laundry to the dryer, and then we'd sit at the small table in the kitchen to go over the upcoming week. In a row house with almost no storage, our lives were managed by a series of lists and precise timings. If we didn't stay on top of the logistics, the house felt like it was closing in on us. I spent most of the morning avoiding the bank app on my phone. I told myself that since the furnace was working and the credit card had covered the bill, there was no need to poke the nest. I didn't want to find out that the slow quarter was more than a temporary dip. I wanted to believe Dennis was just being clumsy with the transfers, a trait he'd had since we were in our 20s, and he'd forgotten to pay the electric bill because he was too focused on a moot court competition. Back then, it was charmingly ambitious. At 50, it just felt like a liability. Around 11, Travis stopped by. He's 72 and lives a few miles away in a place that's essentially a collection of outbuildings and a main house that smells like cedar and old tobacco. He came over to drop off a crate of frozen salmon he'd processed over the summer, which is a staple for us since buying fresh fish in Fairbanks during the winter is a logistical nightmare and a budget killer. Heave it right there on the counter, Travis, I said, clearing a space between the toaster and the fruit bowl. Dennis mentioned he's taking care of that specialized space heater for my bedroom, Travis said, wiping his hands on his flannel shirt. The one with the HEPA filter. He said the payment went through yesterday. I told him it was too much, but he insisted. I stopped mid-reach for a plate. What space heater? Travis looked at me, then looked toward the office nook, where Dennis was still buried in files. The one we talked about last month. For my lungs. He said you were both on board with it. Said it was a family priority for the winter. I felt that same tight knot return to my ribs. We had not talked about a space heater. We had spent the last month discussing the annual premium for our homeowner's insurance, which was due this coming Monday. It was a significant chunk of money, nearly $2,000, and we'd specifically earmarked the savings for it. In a town where the wind can strip the paint off a house in a season, you don't mess with the insurance. I'll be right out, I called, my voice sounding thin. Dennis emerged a moment later, looking rumpled and distracted. He didn't look at me. He went straight to Travis and patted him on the shoulder. Glad the salmon made it, Dad. I'll swing by next weekend to help you set up the heater when it arrives, Dennis, I said, stepping between them. What heater? Dennis paused, his expression shifting into that familiar patient mask. The one for your father, Chris. I told you about it. We discussed it during dinner 2 weeks ago. We did not discuss it, I said. We discussed the insurance premium. We discussed the furnace. We never mentioned a heater. You were exhausted that night, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable, the same tone he used to settle disputes between opposing counsel. You just nodded when I brought it up. I took that as a yes. I figured since we were already talking about winterizing things, you were in agreement. I stared at him. He was doing it again. He was taking a moment where I had been too tired to argue, or perhaps just too quiet, and rewriting it as a consensus. I remembered that dinner. I had been staring at a plate of lukewarm pasta, thinking about a server crash at work, and I probably had nodded just to get him to stop talking so I could eat in peace. I had let the silence stand as a placeholder for a conversation I didn't have the energy for, and Dennis had treated that void as a signed contract. Nodding because I'm tired isn't a budget approval, I said. How much was the heater? It was a high-end model, Dennis said, dodging the specific number. It's an investment in his health. You know how his asthma gets when the air gets this dry. I know how the bank account gets when we spend money we don't have, I replied. Did you use the insurance money? Dennis sighed, a long theatrical sound that suggested I was being unreasonable. I didn't use the insurance money. I just shifted the priority. I'll make up the difference from the next draw. It's a timing issue. Chris. Like I told you with the furnace. The furnace was $1,200. This heater is probably another $600. And the insurance is $2,000. That's a lot of timing issues for 1 month. Travis looked between us, his face reddening. He hates being the center of a domestic dispute. If it's a problem, I can just send the money back, Dennis. I don't need a fancy heater. No, Dad. It's handled, Dennis said quickly, his voice sharpening. Chris is just stressed about work. Don't worry about it. I felt a flash of genuine anger. He wasn't just lying to me. He was playing me for a fool in front of his dad, making it sound like I was just having a bad day at work. He was erasing my agency in real time. I'm not stressed about work, I said, my voice flat. I'm stressed about the fact that our insurance expires on Monday, and I don't know if we have the money to pay the premium. Dennis didn't answer. He didn't look at me. He just turned back to Travis and started talking about the weather, effectively shutting me out of the conversation. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, the smell of frozen salmon filling the room, realizing that my habit of avoiding the fight had given him a map of exactly how to bypass me. Dennis' fam treated my silence as permission and decided to buy the heater without telling me. I watched them walk toward the door, their voices low and conspiratorial. I didn't follow them. Instead, I walked back to the kitchen table and picked up my phone. I didn't open the bank app. Not yet. I just stared at the screen, wondering how many other agreements Dennis had manufactured while I was too tired to ask the right questions. I waited until Dennis went into the shower before I opened the bank app. I didn't want to see his face when the numbers hit the screen, and I didn't want to hear him explain away a balance that didn't add up. When the page loaded, I felt a physical drop in my stomach, like the floor of the row house had suddenly shifted an inch to the left. The savings account wasn't empty, but it was gutted. There was barely $800 left. Between the furnace repair and the heater for Travis, we were already in the hole, and we still had the $2,000 insurance premium due on Monday. My mind immediately went to the slow quarter he'd mentioned. I tried to do the math in my head, calculating his base salary against our fixed costs. But the numbers wouldn't reconcile. Even a lean quarter at the firm wouldn't drain the savings this quickly, unless he was spending money we didn't have. When he came out of the bathroom, smelling of soap and steam, I was sitting at the table with the phone face up. The account is at $800, Dennis, I said. The insurance is due Monday. Where is the rest of the money? He didn't stop moving. He walked to the bedroom to get dressed, his voice trailing back to me. I told you. The draw was lagging. I've been moving things around to cover the essentials. I'll have it sorted by Monday morning. I just need a few more days for the firm to process the overrides. Overrides for what? You're a paralegal, not a partner. You don't get overs on a whim. It's a complex filing, Chris. Just trust me. I'm handling it. By Sunday, the tension had become a physical presence in the house. Something heavy and invisible that sat between us during dinner. Dennis told me he had to spend the entire day and the following Monday morning at the office. He claimed there was a critical filing for a probate case, something about a contested estate in Anchorage. That required his absolute attention. He said he couldn't be disturbed and that he'd handle the insurance payment from his office computer on Monday at noon. I can just do it, I offered. If you give me the login for the insurance portal, I can pay it now and save you the trip to the office. No, he said, his voice sharpening. I've already coordinated it with the agent. I'll do it. I need to make sure the payment is coded correctly for the tax deduction. Just let me focus on this case, okay? I'm under a lot of pressure. I wanted to push. I wanted to ask why a probate filing required him to be unreachable for 48 hours. But I remembered the way he'd looked when Travis was there. That mixture of impatience and perceived superiority. I didn't want another fight that would just end with him telling me I was stressed. I kept my mouth shut, but I didn't believe a word of it. Around 3 o'clock on Sunday, there was a knock at the door. It was Sarah, a junior associate at Dennis's firm. She was a bright, fast-talking woman who often treated Dennis like a mentor, and she was currently holding a stack of folders and a cardboard carrier of coffees. Hey, Christine, sorry to drop in, Sarah said, stepping into the hallway. Dennis mentioned he was taking a mental health weekend to get some house stuff sorted, so I figured I'd just drop these files off here instead of making him come into the office. He said he didn't want to deal with the commute in this slush. I froze, my hand still on the door frame. A mental health weekend? Sarah blinked, her expression confused. Yeah. He emailed the partners on Friday, saying he was offline until Tuesday. He sounded pretty stressed. Actually, said he needed to clear the deck before the new month starts. Is he okay? I didn't answer her immediately. I looked past her toward the office nook where Dennis was currently sitting in total silence, supposedly immersed in a critical filing. He's fine, I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. He's just working, oh, Sarah said, looking puzzled. Well, he specifically told us not to ping him. Anyway, these are for the Miller case. Just leave them on his desk. See you later. As soon as the door closed, I walked straight to the office nook. Dennis didn't even look up from his screen. He was staring at a spreadsheet, his glasses sliding down his nose. Sarah just stopped by, I said. She said you told the firm you were offline until Tuesday. She said you're on a mental health weekend. Dennis stiffened. He didn't move for a few seconds. Then he slowly looked up at me. Sarah exaggerates. I told her I was taking some time, but I'm still working on the Miller files. I'm just doing it from home to avoid the drive. You told me you had to be at the office because of a critical filing. You told me you couldn't be disturbed. You lied about where you were going, so you wouldn't have to talk to me about the insurance money. I didn't lie, he said, his voice sliding back into that professional, reasonable tone. I just simplified the situation. I didn't want you worrying about the commute or the timing. I'm still handling it. Chris, why are you making this a trial? I realized then that the slow quarter and the critical filing were just layers of a story he was building to keep me at a distance. He wasn't just mismanaging money. He was curating a version of his job that didn't actually exist. I felt a wave of exhaustion that went deeper than any work shift. I couldn't do the verbal dance anymore. I couldn't let him rewrite the conversation while I was still in it. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a legal pad from the drawer, and wrote. I didn't write a letter or a plea. I wrote a list. Insurance premium. $2,000 balance. Paid via credit card. Needs reimbursement. Savings balance. $800 shortfall. $1,200 below the list. I wrote one sentence. I need a written explanation of where the missing $200 from the savings account went, and a plan for the insurance payment by 8 a.m. tomorrow. I walked back to the nook and laid the paper directly on top of his spreadsheet. I'm not arguing about Sarah or the commute, I said. I'm not arguing about simplifying the truth. I'm an IT specialist, Dennis. I deal in logs. This is the log of our current situation. I want the answer in writing, or I'm calling the insurance agent myself tonight to see if we can get an extension. Dennis looked at the paper, then looked at me. For the first time, the mask didn't slide back into place immediately. He looked tired, and there was a flicker of something that looked like panic in his eyes, though he quickly covered it with a scowl. This is ridiculous, he muttered. You're treating me like a delinquent. I'm treating you like a husband who can't tell me why our savings are gone, I replied. I walked out of the room and closed the door behind me. I sat on the sofa and listened to the sound of the furnace humming in the walls. The blower motor working perfectly, paid for with money that shouldn't have been missing. I waited for him to come out, but the house remained quiet, the silence. The door to the office nook clicked open about 20 minutes later. Dennis didn't come all the way into the living room. He leaned against the doorframe, his face shadowed. He wasn't holding the legal pad. I can't give you a written plan by 8 tomorrow, he said. His voice was stripped of the professional polish. It sounded thin, like a wire stretched too tight. I don't have a magic button to push that makes the money reappear in the savings account by morning. Then tell me where it went, I said. I didn't move from the sofa. No more slow quarters. No more complex filings. Just the number and the destination. Dennis shifted his weight, looking toward the hallway. I was trying to hedge against the inflation. I put some of the savings into a few speculative plays. Options, mostly. I thought I could turn the insurance premium into a larger cushion for us. I didn't want to tell you because I had it under control, and then the market shifted. He didn't use the word gambling. He used speculative plays and hedging, the language of someone who still believed he could negotiate his way out of a fact. He hadn't confessed a motive or a deep-seated addiction. He had just described a series of bad bets as if they were a clerical error in a ledger. You used our safety net to play the market, I said. And you lied about it for weeks. I didn't lie, he countered, though the conviction was gone. I just didn't disclose the specifics until I could fix it. That is the definition of a lie, Dennis. He stepped into the room then, his expression twisting into a look of genuine frustration. And where were you during all this? Every time I mentioned the budget being tight, you just nodded. Every time I said we were riding a wave, you didn't ask a single question. You just let it happen because you didn't want to deal with the noise of a conversation. I felt a sharp sting of recognition. He was right about that. I remembered the dinners, where I'd felt the shift in his mood, the way he'd become vague about the firm's bonuses, and the way I had consciously chosen to look at my phone or start the dishwasher rather than press him. I'd been so scared of a fight that I'd ignored the red flags in our bank account. By staying quiet to keep the peace, I'd basically given him a map on how to lie to me. I'd let things slide for so long that he had plenty of room to hide his mess. But as I looked at him, I knew that my avoidance didn't give him a license to steal from our future. My silence wasn't a signature on a check, I said. And it certainly wasn't an invitation to buy a $600 heater for your father with money we didn't have. Dennis sighed and rubbed his face with his hand. I knew you'd be against it if I asked. You're always so focused on the numbers that you forget the people. My dad is struggling to breathe in that house. Chris. I couldn't just tell him no because the insurance premium was due. So you just decided for both of us. Yes, he said, his voice flat. He admitted he'd just used my silence as a green light because he knew I wouldn't make a scene. Hearing him admit it didn't feel good. It just proved he saw me as someone to be handled, not a partner. He hadn't apologized for the secrecy. He had justified it as a mercy to his father and a way to avoid my focus on the numbers. The insurance is due tomorrow, I said. How are we paying it? I can take a loan against my 401k, he suggested. It'll take a few days to process, but the agent might give us a grace period if I call him. No, I said. I'm not letting you move more money around in the dark. I want the logins for every account you have. The savings, the 401k, the personal checking you keep for office expenses. I want them tonight. Dennis stiffened. That's a bit extreme, don't you think? I'm a paralegal. Chris, I handle confidential information. I can't just hand over my access. You're a husband who just admitted to speculating with our insurance money, I replied. The confidential part of this marriage is over. Either I get the logins, or I call the insurance agent right now and tell him we can't pay, and we can figure out what happens when the house is uncovered in the middle of a Fairbanks winter. He stared at me for a long time. I could see him weighing the options, trying to find a way to frame this as an overreaction. But I didn't give him the space to build the narrative. I stayed perfectly still, my gaze locked on him, refusing to nod, refusing to look away, refusing to let the silence be a placeholder for anything. Finally, he turned and walked back into the office nook. A few minutes later, he returned with a piece of paper. He had written down the usernames and passwords in a cramped, hurried script. He laid the paper on the coffee table and pushed it toward me with one finger. There, he said. Happy? I'm not happy, Dennis. I'm just informed. He didn't say anything else. He went back into his office and closed the door, the click of the latch sounding final. I picked up the paper and spent the next 2 hours on my laptop. There wasn't a secret stash of money or a total bankruptcy, but the trail was there. There were transfers to a trading app I'd never heard of, small amounts at first that grew into larger, more desperate sums. He hadn't been hedging. He had been chasing losses, trying to win back the money before I noticed it was gone. As I worked, the house grew colder. The sun had long since set, and the darkness of the Alaskan November felt like it was pressing against the windows. I heard the furnace kick on, the blower motor humming with a steady mechanical efficiency. It was a sound I usually associated with comfort, but tonight, It just sounded like a reminder of the cost of things. I closed the laptop and leaned back. For years, I had taken pride in being the one who kept the logistics running, the one who ensured the bills were paid and the schedules were met. I thought I was helping by taking care of everything, but I was actually just making it easier for him to lie. I paid the insurance premium on Monday morning at 8:05. I didn't use the savings account. There wasn't enough left. So I pulled the difference from my own separate account, the one I'd kept for my professional certifications and emergency travel. I didn't tell Dennis I was doing it. I just sent him a screenshot of the confirmation page and a request for the exact amount I'd covered. He tried to call the agent an hour later to smooth things over, but I'd already changed the primary contact email on the policy to my own. When he found out, he didn't yell. He just sat in the living room and told me I was being administratively aggressive. For the next 3 weeks, we lived in a state of managed transparency. I had the logins. I checked the accounts every Tuesday and Friday. Dennis stopped the speculative plays, mostly because he no longer had the autonomy to move money without me seeing the alert on my phone. We stopped talking about the future and started talking about the balance. The real test came in mid-December. We had a shared maintenance fee for the row house, a few $100s for the alleyway snow removal and roof clearing that the neighborhood association coordinated. It was a standard charge, something I usually handled as part of the monthly bill rotation. On a Thursday afternoon, I noticed the payment hadn't been made. I checked the joint account and saw a withdrawal for $400, labeled only as a transfer. I didn't ask him about it. I didn't nudge him during dinner. I just waited. I took care of the snow removal fee, Dennis said as he was clearing his plate. I handled it through the association's old portal, the one they used last year. I thought it would be faster. I stopped scrubbing the pot in the sink. The association moved to a new system in September, Dennis. They sent 3 emails about it. The old portal is dead. He paused, his fork halfway to the trash. They must have had a legacy bridge. I'm sure it went through. It didn't, I said. I checked the account. The money is gone from our balance, but the association hasn't received a dime. Where did the transfer actually go? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the window where the Fairbanks dark had already swallowed the street. I might have misclicked. Or maybe it's just pending. I'll look into it tomorrow. No, I said. You'll look into it now, and you'll show me the transaction receipt. Chris, for God's sake, it's a few $100s. I'm not speculating with the snow removal fee. The amount doesn't matter. The pattern does. He didn't move. He just stood there, waiting for me to let it slide, waiting for the moment where I'd decide that the fight was too loud for the house. That was the moment I stopped. I didn't argue, and I didn't demand the receipt again. Instead, I walked over to the small desk in the hallway where we kept the mail and the shared ledger. I picked up the ledger and the folder of utility passwords and put them in a cardboard box. I carried the box into my bedroom and locked the door. What are you doing? He called out. I'm stopping, I said through the door. I'm not managing the logistics anymore. I'm not tracking the deadlines. I'm not bridging the shortfalls. And I'm not auditing your misclicks. Until we have a written agreement, signed by both of us, that defines exactly who is responsible for which bill, who has access to which account, and what the penalty is for a non-disclosed transfer, I am off the clock. You can't just stop paying the electric bill, he said, his voice rising. I can, I replied. And you can start the process of figuring out how to do it. I spent the next 10 days doing absolutely nothing for the household budget. I paid my own phone bill and my own car insurance. I ignored the emails from the city about the water bill. I stopped meal planning. I stopped checking the savings account. I treated the house like a boarding house where I happened to share a bedroom with a stranger. It was a miserable 2 weeks. The house felt colder, not because of the weather, but because the invisible labor that kept us functioning had vanished. Dennis tried to step up, but he didn't know where the passwords were kept or which bills were on autopay. He missed the water bill. He forgot the heating oil delivery schedule. He came to me on the 12th day, looking frayed. He didn't have a written agreement. He had a list of complaints about how impossible it was. to run a home without a full-time administrator. "I can't do it all, Chris," he said. "I have a job. You have a job. We can't just let the utilities shut off because you're making a point." "I'm not making a point," I said. "I'm showing you what happens when I stop pretending your silence is an agreement." I had assumed that if I could just see the numbers, I could fix the marriage. I thought that transparency was the cure for the lying. But as I looked at him, I realized that the transparency hadn't changed him. It had only changed the way he tried to manage me. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a bookkeeper who didn't ask questions. He didn't regret the gambling or the secrecy. He regretted that I'd found the logs. We didn't sign an agreement. We signed separation papers 3 months later. It wasn't a total ruin. We had enough in the remaining accounts to split the assets without a courtroom battle. And I managed to keep the row house because I was the one who had actually paid the insurance and the taxes for the last 5 years. Dennis moved into a small apartment closer to his firm, a place where he could manage his own speculative plays without anyone watching the screen. The day he moved out, the house was quiet. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of the dishwasher finishing its cycle. A steady, rhythmic thumping that always found comforting. For years, I'd thought that sound meant the house was in order. Now I knew it just meant the machine was doing its job, regardless of who was lying in the next room. I didn't feel a great sense of relief or a cinematic victory. I just felt a strange, light emptiness, like a room that had finally been cleared of old, useless files.